Hi, I'm Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute, and I'm very happy to have with me my good friend Jim Zogby. Jim is the founder and president of the Arab American Institute. He also teaches, taught at the New York University at Abu Dhabi branch, and has been the host of a TV program called Viewpoint with James Zogby that ran on several stations for many, many years. And Jim is a longtime activist in democratic politics in the U.S., in the Democratic Party, partly with the Arab American community, but in the party in general. And he is a member of the executive committee of the Democratic Party and was on the drafting committee in the last convention, as sort of named by Bernie Sanders, as I recall, along with Cornel West, the prominent professor. If I'm right about that.
Yes, there were
so
five.
Let me start
there
there.
were five of us.
Ask you about the convention, the platform drafting process, and particularly the issues related to the Middle East on that committee.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Cornell, but there were five of us. It was Keith Ellison, Cornell, myself, Bill McKibben, one of the extraordinary environmentalists, and Deborah Parker, who was representing Native Americans. She is one of the tribal leaders of the Native American community, advocates. It was an amazing group. I loved being a part of it.
And those were five nominated by Bernie Sanders.
In a drafting committee of 15 people. What was unique about it, I've been involved in the platform committee for actually, I was chair of the resolutions committee of the party for about 11 years, but on previous convention platform committees going back to the 80s. This was the first time that the drafting committee reflected competing points of view. So we never had that before. We always would get a draft written by staff and a few party appointees. This was one where we had a bit of a competition. We had hearings around the country that was really quite an experience. The testimonies were quite instructive. At the same time, we then had a knockdown, drag-out, day-long debate over the issues of the platform, and we won some, we lost a lot, but the overall platform that came out of it was by far the most progressive that the Democratic Party ever passed. I was able to have had a couple of victories on immigration reform and on death penalty, abolishing the death penalty, and a few others, but we also got lots of language along the way in just quiet negotiation over adding something about Lebanon, strengthening the language about the support for Lebanon and Jordan, more language about the Gulf state, the alliances.
Well, let's zero in on,
on the Israeli
Palestinian. The platform is fascinating, but as the Middle East Institute, a number of key issues, the Syrian conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict.
The Syrian
there are
conflict,
differences there between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton.
And what we found in the Syrian conflict was that we ended up not having a fight because we had a resolution we were bringing forward, which I ended up introducing, and I felt awkward about introducing it because it called for opposition to a no-fly zone. But the Clinton people had already stripped that out of the language.
So they did not put it.
No. The language that was in the platform pretty much reflected Bernie's position to begin with. So there was no fight there. On the Arab-Israeli conflict, we ended up, surprisingly, this came out through the hearings, having the issue of the word occupation and settlement be the main concern.
Operative words,
And I had thought we'd end up fighting about a range of other things. That we fought about that was weird. The language that they did already have, again, trying to preempt a fight, was the most supportive of Palestinian rights of any previous platform. I remember in '88 when I tried to bring up the issue of Palestinian rights, I was told a P word couldn't be in the platform. That's what they called it. They wouldn't even use the legitimate rights of the Palestinians, the Camp David language. In the 2004 platform was the first time they talked about two states, but they did it in such a backhanded way that it was more insulting than it was supportive. And in 2008 and 12, the language was, again, you needed a Palestinian state so that Israel would be protected as a Jewish state. I mean, it was sort of subsidiary, subsidiary to Israel's concern. This was the platform that talked about Palestinians deserving independence and dignity and freedom. Actually, it mentions dignity for Palestinians twice. The right to govern themselves freely in their own land, language that I had actually
So would you
written.
say that, and because there are clear differences between Hillary Clinton
Yeah.
and their statements and their speeches and Bernie Sanders on Syria no-fly zones, safe
Yeah.
zones and so on, and on language about Israel in general, with Hillary Clinton having a very, very supportive, whereas Bernie Sanders bringing up the Palestinian issue much more. But I seem to be hearing from you that in the drafting process, those things almost were avoided or watered
They
down.
sought to avoid them. I wanted the word occupation in. We fought about it, but they weren't willing to give. But the language that they did have was better than anything we'd ever seen before. And frankly, if Hillary Clinton had given a speech using the language of the platform, I think people would have been much more supportive in our community of her bid. And they're asking now in the campaign, well, what should she do? And I said, just repeat the language of the platform.
Well, let me ask that. I mean, given your long experience, how important is the platform itself as a document? And in the past, presidents or candidates go on, those who win election, build their own administration and move forward. How binding is it? How important is it at the end of the day?
It's not binding. What it is a quadrennial measure of where the national debate is on a range
In that
of
party,
issues.
to some degree,
And that's all it is. And so when you win something, it means that your language has become more dominant within the overall coalition that forms the party. And so I think that if we see the evolution of language on the Middle East, we see the trajectory of the party changing its tune. Even on the language of BDS, they had language in the platform opposing BDS, and I opposed that in our resolution. What I heard back from the Clinton people is, we're not really opposed to BDS. If you read the sentence, we're opposed to efforts to delegitimize including Israel, including BDS. And then they issued the caveat saying, but if BDS does not seek the delegitimization of Israel, but only advocating for Palestinian rights, it's okay with us. So, in other words, they had to modify language because they knew where the general consensus emerging in the party was. And I think in that sense it's a victory. It's a victory for the politics, not for the policy.
Well, let me talk about the Arab American community or the Muslim American community. There's some overlap, but there are also, different communities.
Widely
there.
divergent, I think, in overall.
Yeah, but talk about the electoral
Yeah.
politics of these communities
Yeah.
in general. How mobilized are they? How are they organized? And then we can get to, are they making a difference? And if so,
Let me
how?
start with the Muslim community because you have to deconstruct it and sort of dissemble the parts.
Yeah.
The African American component is the largest. It is democratic. It votes Democratic because that's the ethnicity. The
it's more
ethnicity
of an
drives
ethnic,
politics. With regard to the more immigrant parts of the Muslim community, again, you have to separate out the Arab from the South Asian. They
Sure.
vote differently.
Yeah.
And they're concerned about different issues. I mean, right now, the South Asian Muslim community is concerned with getting respect and tolerance, etc. The Arabs are still concerned with their foreign policy issues, and the two don't intersect that way. They traditionally, Republicans were right. Those recent immigrant communities were concerned with social issues, and they would tend to vote Republican sometimes. But in 2002, that gap changed. The gap between the born here and the born there, the African American and the South Asian, changed. George Bush changed it all. The gap was slight. It began to open. By the time you get to 2012 and 14, the last polling we did, Muslim Americans, black and immigrant, vote almost 80% plus Democratic.
Wow, that much.
Among the Arab Americans, Muslim and Christian, there was a slight Democratic leaning all the way up to 2000. Even in the 2000 election, they leaned Democratic. That gap has also changed significantly so that today you get Arab Americans identifying as Democrat more than 2 to 1 and voting Democrat way more than 3 to 1, more than 70% vote
goodness,
Democratic.
Yeah. And I would imagine that's gotten
nothing
even more with the candidacy
we're
of Trump.
we'll be polling in
recent.
September.
Yeah.
I see nothing that's happened in the last 2 years since our last poll that would give me any reason to doubt it is continuing. Even if people aren't satisfied with Hillary Clinton, they're so offended, Christian and Muslim, immigrant and born here, by the Republican antics that I just don't see them supporting a Republican nominee.
Where do they make a difference in states? I mean, elections in the U.S., the presidential, all are about swing states,
Yeah.
and whether it's Florida, Ohio, or other states. Where have they made a difference in the past? Where might they make a difference now? Where's the Clinton campaign trying to focus?
The best way to see this is not in a national campaign, because national campaign, everything gets swallowed up by the sort of the bigger picture. It's in local state campaigns, as you're suggesting, and look at governors' races. When folks are running for governor in Michigan, they court the Arab vote. They do it in Ohio, they do it in Pennsylvania, and they do it in Virginia. Going back now 20 years, candidates running for governor in Virginia did events with the Arab community. So those are the states that also will play well in the presidential politics. There's a very large community in California, but they frankly aren't going to make a difference. In Florida, there's a fairly good-sized community, but again, I just don't see the numbers there adding up. But in the states I mentioned, it's going to make a difference. It's going to be important. Now, there are other states with the Arab community also.
So that would be Virginia.
Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. There's almost a connection.
Yeah.
If Illinois were in play, and Illinois is a state where Arab Americans get focused on for governor's races, I just don't think that Illinois is going to turn red. So again, there won't be attention paid. In other states, New Jersey, they get paid attention to. In Connecticut, they get paid attention to. Massachusetts, but again, those states are blue and aren't going to change. But if they went to become swing states, then you'd see presidential campaigns paying attention to them as well.
Let me ask from both ends. I mean, as Arab Americans or Muslim Americans, how do they mobilize within the Democratic Party? Are they mobilized as separate communities or groups, or they're just sort of...
We insist.
And how does like a campaign, a national campaign like the Clinton campaign, interact with them? You mentioned that in governor's races, they go to them, they do events.
Right.
Is that happening at all?
We insist that they be separated out. And we do so because, frankly, if you organize on the basis of religion, you divide communities. There's a lot of component parts of the Arab American community that have a fragile relationship with the overall community. I mean, Chaldeans in Michigan, the Maronites everywhere, the Copts in New Jersey and Ohio. You know, if you say we're organizing the Muslim vote and the Arab vote together, you create friction. And my argument with the campaigns has always been, this is what folks came here to get away from. If you use the religious identity in politics, it becomes confusing. For Pakistanis, it's easy. It's not as easy for Lebanese or Egyptians or Iraqis, etc. So don't go there. So they do have a Muslim outreach, because I think in some cases campaigns are dumb. I mean, they just don't know the communities. So we have to do an education. Every 4 years we go through the same education process and say, you actually need a separate Arab American outreach. In the old days, we used to say you need a separate Muslim outreach to reach the Pakistanis. Don't try to bring them in as if it were one group. And now it's still an ongoing issue for us. But we just had a conference call the other day talking about Arab American outreach and how to do it, not to focus it on religion, focus it on the ethnicity, and I think we'll do okay.
And would you say the levels of mobilization and sort of interaction in democratic politics, both Democratic Party and just democratic politics in general, in these communities is the same as sort of other citizens in general? More mobilization, less? Is there more that needs to be done there?
I chair the Ethnic Council in the Democratic Party. It's all the European Mediterranean ethnic communities. Some of them say to me, we wish we were as organized as Arab Americans. I mean, people in our community don't realize how mobilized they are and how they're looked at by others. But they're a force to contend with in several states, and they have done politics as politics needs to be done. They do good work, and more can always be done. And I think that, Bernie obviously generated tremendous enthusiasm. Barack Obama did the same. Hillary Clinton, it's a little less enthusiasm right now. And being opposed to Trump isn't enough for Arab Americans to want to get full swing behind it. So I think that, you know, some work needs to be done, and we're talking to the Clinton campaign about the fact they need to do more. They need to make this less of a heavy lift for those of us who are trying to get the vote out. But in the states where we've talked about, we will have, as the Institute, our normal program. Every 4 years we do Yellow Vote. Yellow Vote will have...
Yellow Vote.
Yeah, it'll have field organizers in every state. We'll do voter registration, which we're doing right now, and then we'll turn that into voter mobilization. We'll do phone banking, and we'll do door-to-door in concentrated Arab neighborhoods, and we'll have hundreds of volunteers working to get the vote out. And it'll be a nonpartisan project, but it'll also focus on state and local races, because there's a lot of those. We've got some really great young Arab Americans running for everything from Board of Education to school board, to city council, to we've got some great candidates for Congress, new ones that we hope will win. And Charles Bustani's running for Senate in Louisiana. So the effort is wide-ranging, bigger than the presidential campaigns, and it's part of the empowerment project that the Institute was created to develop 30 plus years ago.
Fantastic. Well, let me end sort of circling back to where we began about policy. And if Hillary Clinton indeed is elected president, and maybe you give us your thoughts. I mean, obviously people are expecting that it should be a victory there, but I mean, if you have some thoughts about the risks in the election itself. But I wanted to end with a few of your policy reflections. How do you see a Clinton presidency sort of rolling out in terms of Middle East initiatives? Remember, Obama came into office his first day, appointed George Mitchell, peace process. He reached out, to the Arab Muslim world. He did a few things in the very beginning. What might you expect in terms of Middle East policy from the first 100 days, as they say?
First of all, I would say that this election is not a slam dunk. It's not over yet, and I think the polls, which are all over the place, are frankly very difficult to use as predictors right now. It is the period between the conventions and Labor Day, always a difficult time, and the electorate is quite volatile. So when you've got Hillary Clinton having a 67% negative trust, people don't trust her, and Donald Trump, people don't trust him either, I think this is going to go either way, and I therefore think a lot of work needs to be done by folks in the Clinton campaign to win it. It's not going to be. They cannot sit on their laurels. What would Hillary Clinton do if she's elected? I think that's a question mark. Clearly,
although she's been Secretary of State, she's given dozens of speeches,
but her record is not sterling, frankly, and. Since James Baker, we haven't had a Secretary of State with accomplishments, right? And with an actual track record. He was the least policy-oriented, but he was the most political. He understood the need of being arrogant, tough, mean, and use pressure when needed on everybody. He didn't give a damn. He just got the job done, and he was quite extraordinary. I mean, I don't think we would have made it through the Cold War as easily as we did, that transition, without a Bush and Baker team. Given that, I think that Hillary Clinton has all the ability to be as steely as James Baker. Those who look at her letter on Israel or her positions on Israel, I would say, again, I wouldn't count on that. This is a woman who, as president, I think would have the ability to run over Benjamin Netanyahu if it were in the interests of her presidency and the United States of America to do so. I think she's tough, and I don't think anybody owns her. Anybody has ever owned her, and I think she'll be strong. What she has done politically is no measure of what she would do policy-wise, because I think in many ways she's a blank slate. Again, as Secretary of State, she traveled everywhere, but to find her imprint is tough to see. She was part of internal debates when internal debates
took place. The decisions weren't hers at the end of the day.
That's different, and I think that we'll see early on who gets the appointments, and even now, and who's advising the campaign. It's fairly low-level folks. I don't think we're seeing that, but my sense is that what matters to me is not the letter she wrote here or the letter she wrote there, but who is the coalition that actually comes together around a candidate. And as an Arab American, I say all of our allies are Democrats in that coalition. We don't have allies right now on the Republican side. This isn't the party of George Herbert Walker Bush anymore. It's not the party of General Eisenhower anymore. It's the party of not just Donald Trump, but Donald Trump and the evangelicals and the neocons. They've taken it over. Now the neocons have wanted to make a shift over to Hillary. The question is, do they and what they represent outweigh the importance of the African American and labor and women and other groups who are going to be pushing in a different direction against an interventionist America, against a militaristic America, and against America that actually is going to betray its values with regard to conflicts around the world. So I think we'll see. We're in a transitional period. I've argued that we're kind of, I call it a Goldilocks moment, and I saw a writer use it the other day, got me mad. It was my expression.
Copyright on that.
Yeah, we had too much with George Bush. We had too little with Barack Obama. We're looking for just right.
Maybe just
I'm
right.
hopeful that Hillary Clinton could be
very interesting point. I mean,
right.
that you talk about the coalition and the powers around her, but also that Hillary Clinton, despite her long history, as it were, in politics and even in foreign policy, isn't it maybe as president yet to reveal who she really is and what she will really do?
I remember when Bill Clinton came to speak at the Arab American Institute in '98. It was the first time he'd ever spoken to any president spoken to an Arab American. We walked out, and as we walked out, people stood up cheering. And he said, I said to him, "Mr. President, they love you." And he said, "They don't. They love Hillary." She had just made the statement about Palestinian state. He was right. But she started running for Senate in New York, and she shifted. She was Secretary of State, and she's the one who called Netanyahu and gave him hell on settlements, and then publicly made a very strong statement.
So we'll see.
I think she'll be the Hillary Clinton she needs to be to get a job done. The question is, what's the job she's going to want to get done? And if Benjamin Netanyahu gets in the way, if I were him, I'd beware that he doesn't end up with some tire tracks over his back.
Message to Netanyahu right there. Well, I want to thank you very much, Jim, head of the Arab American Institute and member of the Executive Committee of the Democratic Party. And I'm Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute. Thank you for joining us.